from there, maybe do a quick visit to Palestine. We had a very, very moving talk from Jimmy Carter yesterday. How many of you were at that talk? Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Yeah, it was probably a little more nostalgic for me than it was for you, because as he pointed out, you weren't born when he was president, but I was walking the streets of Tomales, California, stopping votes for him. So it was really very emotional for me when he started speaking. I remembered his voice and how the things that we complained about then were absolutely absurd compared to the things we got going for us now. But we had a longish meeting with him after the talk, about 25 of us, thanks to the generosity of Rabbi Lerner, and he made it even more poignant than he had during the big talk that while the substantial majority of people in the United States and Israel, not to mention Europe and the rest of the world, want a peace agreement in Israel-Palestine, something happens to make it not only difficult but impossible to get. And I thought it might be good for us to think about that a little bit, because we've been talking all along about how awkward it is to work with established structures. And here I once went summer, I guess, to Washington, D.C. with the Tikkun community to talk to congresspeople. Every congressperson that I went to see, and I heard the same report from most of them, they were so glad to see us. They said, we see nothing but AIPAC, AIPAC, AIPAC. This is the pro-Israel, pro-aggression lobby. And we agree with you, and we would love to give you what you want, but we would not be reelected. So there's a strange thing that happens where the majority of people, as people, want one thing, which is a reasonably just solution. We're not talking a revolution here or a world of peace or anything like that, but just a reasonable adjustment. And yet between the will of the people and the decision by the people, something happens to turn everything drastically to the right. Yeah, to the right. So I was struck, having that in the back of my mind, when I read the latest newsletter from CPAS. This is an organization that we've mentioned before. Stands for Servicio Paz y Justicia, Peace and Justice Service. And they operate throughout Latin America, but the particular focus is in Mexico. And within Mexico, they're particularly focused on movement in Chiapas, and we haven't talked about that movement very much. But I'm back one topic now, and I'm out of the spiritual dimension of the Cultural Revolution, and we're back to the topic we were talking about, the struggle against globalism. So the struggle against globalism is acute in these villages and small communities in Mexico where, I mean, if you think about the situation that we've created here, it's pretty appalling. We have ruined their economic hopes, so they're now impoverished and in many cases pushed from poverty to destitution. And then when they try to get out, we build this huge fence, and we have people with machine guns to keep them out. So it's, this is probably an exaggeration, and probably going to be sorry that I said this in front of the whole wide world web, but it's almost like a kind of economic genocide that's going on, where we impoverish people and then don't let them escape from the poverty that we've created for them. So the EZLN, the Zapatista Liberation Army, has taken matters into their own hands. And one of the things that, okay, I should stop myself before I go too far and say, I am not saying that the Zapatistas are a nonviolent movement, purely and simple. It's not like that. They are, I would say, they are nonviolent wannabes. I think I told you that we had a message from Subcomandante Marcos. That you'd write a film or a novel about that, a message from the Subcomandante, his mask. And we were meeting at a Quaker meeting place south of here, Ben Lomond, about nonviolence and TPNI, though we didn't call it that then. And he sent a message by one of his people saying, yes, we are doing this militarily, but if you show us a different way, we will take it. So that to me was underscoring the importance of nonviolence education. And again, to say that this is not a nonviolent movement yet, it's very complicated. There are many actors, some of them covert. But the point for right now is that what they have stimulated is different kinds and formats of organization. So, for example, they had a meetic in a region called Oventique, which is kind of a headquarters for them. And at the beginning of the struggle, they actually took over this region, so it is actually something that would not be tolerated in the United States. There's a region in which federal government does not, its writ does not run. They can't intervene there, to a great large extent. You try that here, the results will be very serious. We tried to get a little park in Berkeley, which would not belong to the federal authorities, and people died over that struggle. Now, there's one little circle 6 inches in diameter in the middle of Sproul Plaza, which doesn't belong to anybody, but I would be tempted to call that symbolic. Anyway, they have an area in which they're able to really kind of recreate governmental authority on their own. And there was a meeting in December to January called the Encounter of the Zapatista People with the Peoples of the World. I'll have this here if you want to look at it. More than 2,000 people from 47 countries took part, 3,000 Zapatistas in addition from support bases, 200 members of 40 autonomous town councils, that's one type, autonomous town councils, representatives of 5 good government committees, several members of the General Command of the Clandestine Revolutionary Indigenous Committee, that must be a nice acronym, and they have organizations also from Caracoles. Caracoles is a snail, right? So I think the idea here is that it's not hierarchical, but sort of centrifugal organization of that kind. So amazingly enough, and I don't think there are different Caracoles that have names like La Realidad and so forth, Roberto Barrios. In this way, this is a statement from one of the snails. In this way, the other government was initiated. Now, what are we going to call this? What's our technical term for this? The parallel institution. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Parallel institutions. Very good. Yeah. And remember, this is the most important type of parallel institution, and the most, it's the most dangerous. Carry on. Paolo? Well, it's like this. It's not a hierarchy. It's a central kind of organization. Michael. The slowness of the snail? Could be. Not the bad taste. Okay. Well, I don't myself know. Come on up, Michael. I don't myself know exactly how it works. But the point that I want to make is that these are people who have invented alternate. We're talking about Chiapas at the moment. People who've invented alternative governmental forms. And I just will leave this here, and I'll leave it at that. And I recognize that we've had no time for review today, and I haven't given you a passage for analysis. So let's do that pretty intensely on Tuesday. I'll mail you out a couple of passages, or at least one, and look over the ID forms, ID terms, especially the ones that we haven't actually covered yet, and just go through the whole semester. Insurrectionary movements, the reform movements, the anti-globalism movements, and now finally the spiritual revolution. It's represented here. And that'll be a big chance for you to have questions. I will try to do something which, as I was telling people this morning, is very unnatural for me, which is not talk. And just be here to answer your questions. All right. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Lerner, who is going to talk to us about spirituality and social change, and what, in particular, the Network of Spiritual Progressives is doing about it. Rabbi Lerner was at one time called by J. Edgar Hoover, I think, the most dangerous man in America. You're very, very proud of that designation. Actually, I think Hoover was the most dangerous man in America, but you got to choose your dangers in this world. And he has started a network and a community, and as you probably most of you know, a magazine called Tikkun, which was necessary to form when the premier Jewish journal took a turn to the right and became commentary. So he said, the rest is commentary, this is reality. And 2 years ago in the summer, Michael and I put on a conference, he did all the work, called the Spiritual Activism Conference, which was a fantastic success. We had about 1,400 people. And out of that, we're trying to develop a network of spiritual progressives balancing the need for some kind of organization with the need to escape hierarchical and organization. So I think that having been said, Michael, more could be said about you, but I think we want to hear it from you. Can you sit there?
I might. Okay, maybe I'll try to stand. Is that better? Have any of you seen Tikkun magazine? Anybody here seen it? Okay, not many. So I'm going to ask. You want to pass it around? I'm going to pass it around and. Oh yes, and this is an ad that well, actually, it has two sides. One side is an invitation for people to become interns with us. Tikkun is located in Berkeley, and the Network of Spiritual Progressives is located in Berkeley. And so we have summer internships, and we have internships for September to June of next year. So that's one side of that thing. But we don't have enough for each of you to keep it. But look at it. You can read through the ad. The second side is an ad that we're about to place in the New York Times that, in a way, is a manifestation of the spiritual politics that we've been developing. What's this for? Oh, okay. Okay. It's an interfaith organization, and it's co-chaired by myself and Cornell West, who is an African-American a social change activist and professor of African-American studies at Princeton, and by Sister Joan Chittister, who is a Benedictine sister and probably the most outspoken feminist in the Catholic world. So it's definitely not just for Jews. It's an interfaith organization. And the Network of Spiritual Progressives is for not just for people who are into a religion, but also into God, but for anybody who has a spiritual consciousness. So that doesn't require that you believe in God or that you're part of a religion if you consider yourself in some way spiritual. I think I'll start by saying how we arrived at building a network of spiritual progressives this way. I was a social change activist here in Berkeley and was on the on the executive committee of the free speech movement. It was interesting to hear last night the chancellor saying, "Well, we've always been for free speech here. This is our tradition," and we had to force it down their throats, and at the cost of many of us being arrested and so forth. And then, well, whatever. I won't go there. But I was also president of Berkeley Students for Democratic Society, which was an activist anti-war organization in the '60s. I was in the heat of that. I was involved, and then went to Seattle as a professor of philosophy. I got a PhD in philosophy here from Berkeley, and there is where J. Edgar Hoover came into the scene. I led some organized demonstrations that were at the time the biggest thing that Seattle had ever seen, and was eventually arrested, indicted with 7 others as part of the Seattle 8 conspiracy, they called it, and sent to federal penitentiary for contempt of court, for which I have to admit that I was guilty. I did have a lot of contempt for the way the judicial system was working at the time. And afterwards, I watched the movement itself destroy itself in a whole variety of self-destructive ways. I can talk about that more if you want to hear about it. But I decided that understanding ideas was not enough. I had, at the time, I thought, and still in retrospect think, a lot of good ideas. But the ideas were not sufficient to understand what was going on. Because I had all these good ideas, and we in the movement had all these good ideas. Why weren't people getting it? Why weren't people listening? And why were people even in the movement acting in such self-destructive ways? So I went back to graduate school and got a second PhD, this time in clinical psychology, to try to understand the psychological dynamics that were leading, on the one hand, leading people inside the movement to act self-destructively towards each other. And on the other hand, I wanted to understand why the rest of the society wasn't jumping up and throwing away their crutches and saying, "Hallelujah, hey, we got it. Yeah, your analysis is great, terrific, we're with you." So after I got my PhD in psychology, I was very fortunate to have convinced the National Institute of Mental Health to give me a research grant, and began an organization called the Institute for Labor and Mental Health, which we started in Oakland. And over the course of the next 29 years, we developed a study of the psychodynamics of American society. And that study was, although NIMH thought we were studying something slightly different than what we were studying, that study did ask the following question: why are people moving to the right politically? Why are they not responding to us? What is it in their life experience? And very quickly, we came to, well, we listened to people's stories. For those of you who think in statistical terms, the N was 10,000. We had over 10,000 people. And this wasn't what we call drive-by sociology, where you put a questionnaire in front of somebody or a quick telephone interview, and then you think you know what's going on in their lives. Well, we found we ran groups that went from 8 to 10 weeks with middle-income working people. And in these groups, what people would say the first or second week was very, very different than what they would say the 8th or 9th week. Because in these groups, as trust developed, and then as new ideas came into people's heads, they were able to talk about things that they would have never acknowledged to a sociologist or to an interviewer about themselves, things that they themselves were scared to think about in themselves, but eventually did come out in these groups. And so let me tell you what we learned. First of all, what we learned is that the issue, when we asked people to tell about their lives, the first thing they went to was the world of work. And which is probably something that at least a fair number of you aren't that familiar with yet. But let me tell you about the world of work, what they were telling us. Most people end up working in work situations in which the bottom line of the institutions within which they work is to maximize money and power. And your value in the world of work is judged by how much you are successful in maximizing money and power. Now, this is not true for every workplace. It's only true for what the overwhelming majority of Americans face in their lives. But you could have grown up in a family and even in a neighborhood where you never even met anybody who was working in such a workplace. I don't know you. So it's totally possible, since there's a fair number of upper middle class jobs that are available to people where they do get a chance to use their intelligence, their creativity, where the bottom line isn't so explicit, where the workplace isn't so clearly and solely dedicated in that way. We also found out, by the way, people say, well, but I work in a nonprofit, and then it turned out the bottom line was to maximize the ego gratification of the people at the top. But for most people, they don't work in nonprofits. They work in institutions in which the bottom line is that. But what I'm saying to you might not click for you if you've never been in this kind of a workplace. But what's important to understand is that while there are many other kinds of workplaces, and you might be lucky enough, in fact, I'm sure that most of you will end up in places different than that, that the experience of day-to-day life for most Americans is going to a workplace in which the bottom line is to maximize money and power. And in that workplace, your value is shaped by your ability to convince those who have power over you, your supervisor or their supervisor or their supervisor, that your contribution, directly or indirectly, I mean, in other words, you could be a research scientist and you're not expected to immediately produce something that's worthwhile from the standpoint of maximizing money and power, but indirectly, that is, the whole institution within which you work judges whether your work unit or the whole sphere of research that you're doing is ultimately going to produce something that they can sell. And if it doesn't, and your unit isn't producing that even in the long run, they don't want you. So your value is in how much you can maximize money and power. And corresponding to that comes another recognition that people told us was central to their daily reality, which is that the common sense of the world of work is nobody is here to take care of me, to look after me. Everybody is here to maximize their own advantage, to look out for number one, as they put it. And that this is the common sense that people learn day in and day out. Looking out for number one is the fundamental reality of the world of work in which the bottom line is maximizing money and power. And as a consequence of that, that people are learning how to see each other primarily from the standpoint of, what can you do for me? Can you be of use to me? How can whatever you're doing maximize my advantage? And this is not because people never went to never had a consciousness racing. It's not because there's something wrong with the people. It's that the very structure of the work situation generates and regenerates and rewards this consciousness. Okay, everybody getting what I'm saying? Maybe it's obvious to you, right? At one level, it is obvious to everybody. Whenever I speak about it, at least for people who have been in the world of work, it's obvious. Oh yeah, we knew that, but not quite in these words. But nevertheless, we knew this. So, pardon me. So as a result, all day long, people are learning how to look out for number one and how to see other people in terms of, what can you do for me? How will you deliver for me? What can you give me? And then they bring that home out of the world of work in the few waking hours that people have, outside the world of work. So that way of thinking can't be taken off sort of like dirty clothes, like when you were a miner and you were working in a factory and you could take off, you could get one good shower and you were out of there. But there was some sense in the previous history of America where workers were in those kinds of situations where there was solidarity in the world of work. Today, it's quite the opposite. There's a sense of aloneness, everyone out for themselves. And that then generates a consciousness that is brought home into personal life, where the number one complaint that people have when you talk to them about this society is, I feel alone. I don't know who I can trust. Everybody seems just out for money and power for themselves. They're just looking out for number one. And this is not a paranoid perception. This is actually a quite accurate perception of what everybody around them is doing. And so the common sense seems to be repeated. It's repeated not only in their interactions, but it's massively reinforced by television, in which almost every sitcom, in which almost every the sort of shared assumption of every movie is this, that obviously people are looking out for themselves. And you don't have to preach it. It's the motivation that is assumed to understand the characters in any of these movies or sitcoms, or at least the vast majority of sitcoms and movies, that people are looking out for themselves and trying to maximize their own advantage. In the sitcoms, it's who's going to have the best relationships, who's going to get the best dates, who's going to be whatever, who's going to be on top as opposed to on bottom in any exchange between people. The assumption is that everybody is just out to maximize their own advantage. And that is so clear that by the time you're 3, if you're getting what's happening in any of the cartoons that you've seen, where one is beating up the other, or the little animals and so forth, they all have the same personality structure as America. That is, they're all looking out for themselves and maximizing their own advantage without regard to the consequences of the other. And it's all supposed to be very humorous and funny, but it is absorbed into the consciousness of children at a very, very early age that this is how it is in this world. So growing up in this society and then entering the world of work, one gets a massive dose of this conditioning. Understand that this conditioning isn't some content about some specific policy. It's not about, you should be a Democrat or you should be a Republican, okay? You should be conservative or you should be liberal. It's pervasive through the consciousness of everyone. It's a much deeper level of conditioning, and it shapes how people interact with each other. And it has a dramatic consequence of making people feel very lonely. If there aren't any people in the room who are old enough to be even thinking about this, but I can tell you that one part of our study ended up being around people who were in retirement age, and many of them reported the decline in friendships. And what happens is that friendships increasingly become